said before how I'm a big fan of Bob Dylan, especially his early work. I see him as light years ahead of other popular musicians, lyrically, poetically and thematically. I think Bishop Barron, the famous Catholic YouTuber, is correct in that you can only really properly understand Dylan once you see he's a spiritual songwriter above all else. While I can still appreciate the call to treat all human beings with dignity and justice, to not brutalise any people or any group, it does seem to me that his, and by association the 1960s worldview in the West, hasn't exactly come into fruition like they said it would. I'm speaking in reference to this case in America featuring an Austin Metcalf, who's on the left of your screen here. To all accounts, he was a talented athlete with a high grade point average, he was a devout Christian, and he was only 17, and he was murdered by Carmelo Anthony, who's on the right of your screen, for apparently telling him that he was sitting in the wrong seat during athletics training. Now let's just run over the quick switcheroo again to get it out of the way. We all know what would happen if this was the other way around. Celebrities would be crying their eyes out, 24/7 wall-to-wall news coverage all year. Global leaders, especially Western leaders, would be taking the knee. Premier League footballers taking the knee. On and on it would go, telling white people they're all demonic and essentially they need to sort themselves out because this is the lived black experience. Yet when the roles are reversed, as you can see, the American media doesn't think it's worth mentioning that it was a black lad that killed a white lad, stabbed him in the heart actually, and he died in the arms of his twin brother, bleeding to death. Now I've no doubt, even in covering this news, I'll get another great big red splodge next to my name somewhere deep in the recesses of Starmer's Stasi HQ. And that's because even highlighting these stories is suspicious to the powers that be. Don't I know that I'm shedding a negative light on a minority group? This could harm diversity. What am I, some sort of evil bigot? We should know by now that we're only supposed to highlight the cases that affect young black men, no matter how spurious they are. Just shut up and do what the media tell you. The whole thing brings to mind the murder of Chris Donald, which I know was over 20 years ago, but most people don't even know this even happened. And we know all about Stephen Lawrence, and that was a terrible murder too, but this was on the same par as, if not worse than that. For those who don't know about this, about 20 years ago, Chris Donald, a Scottish lad who was completely innocent and didn't know this gang, was kidnapped by a Pakistani gang, driven around blindfolded, then taken to a remote location, stabbed, and as he bled to death, they doused him in petrol and set him on fire. Now, the reason many people don't know about this is because the media buried it and has ever since. If anybody dares raise it, they're immediately tarnished as evil and far right and as if they just want to cause trouble. Now, I'm not referencing this case in order to create some wanton hate towards Pakistanis. I'm sure Pakistanis in Britain are outraged by instances like this as well, just as you do find black American voices in the US that are calling out the hypocrisy too.
What's more of a tragedy? George Floyd overdosing on fentanyl under the knee of Derek Chauvin, or this 17-year-old boy, honor roll student, devout Christian, stabbed in the heart at a track meet?
And this is my point. There'll be no beautiful Bob Dylan songs mourning the senseless murder of this lad, no speeches from international leaders. He's a price worth paying for diversity, collateral damage. Yet I do think outside of the mainstream political and media landscape, more and more people are saying, yeah, alright, we're evil, terrible and racist, but someone has to answer the question, what are we going to do about instances like this? Now, one of the saddest photos I saw is this one of Austin Metcalf. He's doing a pseudo rapper sign. You see kids do these a lot these days. They're copying the mainstream black guys and so on. But again, it's a symbol of how he's trying to integrate himself into American ghetto culture, the very same culture that killed him. Now, the first thing to address here is, are we just being needlessly racist? Are we being anecdotal and just picking out this one case to demonise black folks? You very often hear this when these topics are raised. This guy went semi-viral on Twitter. He's a black fella stating this: I hate degenerate blacks more than anyone, but a lot of whites use these incidents to justify their irrational fears of blacks, and it's extremely fascinating how they've fallen into the victimhood culture. So let's assess this claim if white folks have just simply got irrational fears of black violence and whether we've fallen into victimhood. This is data from 2019 from America on the race of victims of homicide and the race of the perpetrators. Now remember, to any leftists who've stumbled upon this video, we have to adjust this for per capita. White Americans make up about 71% of the population right now in the States, and blacks make up around 13 to 14%. So as you can see here, in 2019, there were 3,300 homicide victims who were white, and 2,600 of those were killed by other whites, 566 were killed by blacks. When it comes to blacks, there were 2,900 homicide victims, 246 of the killers of those black people were white, and 2,574 were other blacks. So the first inference we can draw from this is the vast majority of people who are murdered by people of the same racial category. However, the data also clearly indicates that blacks kill whites at twice the rate despite being 5 times less of the mass population. So in essence, en masse, black on white murder is relatively rare, although it's far from irrational to be concerned by this trend, and furthermore, it's not victimhood culture at all to note the massive discrepancy in the data when it comes to racialized murder. Now, even if you could get the mainstream political and media establishment to acknowledge this data, the best you'd get from them is, yeah, well, you created the evil Western culture which is so racist anyway and makes black folks do this, so shut up and suck on a lemon. Yet as you might imagine, given over here in the UK we tend to do everything America does only 2 years later and on a more minor scale, we're falling down exactly the same path. Here's a story from a couple of years ago featuring a rapper who said he had to create his own record label because he was facing racism in Norwich. For those who don't know, Norwich is a sleepy city on England's east coast where essentially nothing really happens. But just the other day, this fella, Rutendo Matsika, was jailed for 13.5 years, a further 5 years on licence, for attacking a couple with a knife, a hammer and a pole. Now, when we look at murder victims across the whole of the UK by ethnicity, we can see that every single group bar black people features at a lower percentage than that it represents in the whole population. As you can see here, black murder victims are over 4 times the rate of their population percentage, and the liberal media actually really likes to talk about this because it can make out that black folks are the victims here. However, they're not so keen on outlining the data regarding the perpetrators. This is the data from March 2022 to March 2024. Around 1 in 5, that's 20% of suspects for murder were identified as black. That's 5 times higher than their representation in the general population. So if we compare the two data sets, we can see that black folks are actually more represented in homicide murders than they are as homicide victims. Now make of this what you will, but it seems to me that beautiful Bob Dylan songs aren't going to answer this complexity, nor can we simply say that this is only the result of black folks tending to be of a lower socio and economic status. After all, other groups are of lower socio-economic status and they don't have the same rates when it comes to murder. Now, as stated prior, I'm not making this video to promote hatred towards any group or so people go and scream at other groups yelling all sorts of racial obscenities. That massively backfires. It's exactly what the mainstream wants. It allows them to ignore these very important issues by saying, look at these maniacs who are saying these awful things. And then they can go back to their cozy, idealised liberal bubble, a world that we're stuck in at the moment where police are now urging parents to report their children to prevent, that's counter-terrorism, if they watch, quote, misogynistic videos online. Now in closing, while I'd agree it's moral to not judge a whole group by the actions of a violent minority, the core point is you don't know who that violent minority is within a group sometimes. And as I've had to say to my wife in our forays into London, when you're walking into the Tube and some young, how would you put it in a politically correct manner, talented architects, engineers and classical musicians barge into you, the best thing you can do is let it go and mind your own business. And that's because you don't know if they're armed with knives, if they'll stamp on your head, if they knock you down, and even if you do manage to overcome them, you just end up on the front page of the BBC and The Guardian as some evil racist attacker who attacked these innocent bunnies for no reason. However, it seems to me that the prophecy of Scott Adams is making sense to more and more people with each passing day. However, do let me know your thoughts about all this down below, and do consider subscribing to the channel if you're new.